These are some thoughts I've been having about Spring Boot, the popular Java framework. I wanted to share some of my complaints, some of my criticisms, and some of my learnings and guidance that I've realized over the years that hopefully can help you make decisions in your software engineering careers, and whether you're an employee at a company or whether you're starting a business and are trying to understand, are my engineers being as productive as they could be? This is a really controversial topic. I know people have very strong opinions about programming languages and very strong opinions about programming libraries like Spring, and these are just some thoughts that I have. So first off is, what is Spring, or what is Spring Boot? And Spring is kind of the dominant library that Java programmers use to manage their code across a lot of directories, I guess is the most succinct way to say it. Basically, when you have a great deal of different business logic spread over many different classes, and in Java they call them packages, is your directory structure. Spring allows you to create more rigorous rules around if you want to use a class from one directory or package in another directory or package or in another code repository. Spring allows you to create what are called beans, and beans are another way of calling a constructor if you want to instantiate an instance of a class. So Spring is a framework on top of Java to augment the things you might just use Java for example, to construct an object. This creates all kinds of complexity. If you're used to programming in Python or Ruby or JavaScript or whatever, these are just constructors, but Spring has a lot more rules around instantiating objects and doing so without needing to know at the time that you construct an object everything that you might want when you construct the object. So my main criticisms of Spring are relating to its slowness. I think a lot of people who come to Java can empathize with my experience where Python, Ruby, JavaScript, generally when you run a program, it starts instantaneously. If it's a web application, if you're running Ruby on Rails or Django, if you try to run the web application locally, it can start receiving incoming HTTP requests in under 1 second. With Spring Boot, or Spring, it takes up to 10 seconds, and depending on the application, it could take up to a minute or more for your application to start fully being able to receive incoming web requests. And I could go into why that's the case, or is it my fault or my coworker's fault, but there's something deeply wrong with the design of Spring as a framework that allows the process time to take so long to start up. People give a lot of credit to Java for how fast it is, and the reality is that at runtime, when it is actually running, it is quite fast, and it is pretty efficient at utilizing the hardware resources it's running upon. But when you're trying to start up an application, or if you're quickly iterating and trying to restart a web application you're editing, it is horrible. It is nowhere near as productive, in my experience, to be developing a Spring Boot app as it is to be developing a Ruby on Rails or Django or whatever JavaScript, Node.js web framework you're using. So that's my first criticism of Spring. You're welcome to disagree with me in the comments, give guidance about how to make that boot up time faster, but even the vanilla demo Spring Boot app, if you go through the tutorial on the official website, takes multiple seconds to boot. This is really important because this has big implications for your productivity, whether you're an employee software engineer or a business owner. Either case, you're not going to learn as fast. You're not going to learn as fast about how to be productive in building your software. That's true of you as an employee. As a business owner, it'll be really hard for you to quickly iterate and build and learn what features or what changes are most valuable to the business if it takes your employees 10 seconds every time they need to make a change to infer whether that change is reflected in their software. So this productivity hit is really big, and I think people who work at larger tech companies where they're shielded from the business risks of slow innovation because they may already have a great business and it's not so important what your productivity looks like as an individual employee. It's important for startups, and I think if I were starting a startup today or tomorrow, or you started a startup today or tomorrow, you should think critically about whether Java and Spring Boot, as mature as they are ideal for your use case. This is true of any programming language you would choose. First, you should probably choose the thing you're most comfortable with. Second, you should choose something that's widely popular in the marketplace because you'll have a much, much easier time of hiring people and finding existing talent. But productivity and your personal enthusiasm for your work is really important. And if it takes 10 seconds to start up your application, that can be really demoralizing. And it can make it harder to solve things like bugs that existing paying customers of yours are experiencing. So that's one of my biggest criticisms. The second is a lot of positive things are said about Java as far as, oh, it has type safety. It has really strict type safety that allows the compiler to catch all kinds of problems that if you were to write your software in Python or Ruby or JavaScript where there's not type safety strictly, that there's more bugs in Python and JavaScript and Ruby code. Java saves you all that. The reality is Spring cheats you because when you use Spring, you open yourself up to an entire new category of runtime error. Instead of Spring and Java catching at compile time that you have a missing constructor or bean not found exception, this now is pleasantly delivered to you when you actually try to spend 10 seconds starting up your application. At the end of 10 seconds, Spring will tell you in a 50-line stack trace, oh, a bean you thought you could use in whatever code you're using couldn't be found. And it leads to this deep dive, awful debugging process of identifying how is it that I've failed to specify a bean that needs to be used in my code. This is a category of problem that Spring invented that did not exist with Ruby or Python or JavaScript. So this is a category of problem that Spring invented that you should be wary of, and people who have got a lot of experience with Java and Spring, they might be comfortable with a 50-line stack trace and understanding, okay, here's the iterative series of steps I need to take to track down why is a bean missing in my code. But it's a runtime exception, and it's something that Java advocates for a long time have said, Java saves you from runtime exceptions. But it's all baloney because Spring reintroduces this problem. And I will say there's a caveat, which is there's a category, an alternative to Spring in Java called Dagger, which is a framework for dependency injection coming from Google that's been around for a few years and is semi-popular with Android developers, from what I can understand. And it actually pulls forward be not found exceptions to the point of compilation. So when you build your application to jar or whatever, Dagger, instead of Spring, will actually warn you of these be not found exceptions at build time rather than at runtime. So this is, I think, also a critical flaw of Spring, and I think in the long run, Spring has some serious critical issues that make it pretty undesirable. I don't think it's going away by any means. These are just a sampling of experiences I've had with Spring and Spring Boot that make me very cynical about its value as a framework. That leads me to my third criticism, which is around how to actually use Spring. So I've glossed over what a bean is. I've kind of alluded to that it's an alternative to a constructor for creating an instance of a class. But there's really inconsistent guidance about how to use beans. In fact, there's 3 different ways to use them. There's constructor injection, there's property or field injection, and then there's setter injection. And at the different places that I've worked in my career, I've seen programmers use all 3. Setter injection being the least common, property injection being the most common. And in reality, that inconsistency and that lack of prescribing how to use beans leads to a fuck ton of confusion, and it leads to a lot of longer documentation in the Spring documentation, the official docs, than I think it merits. And it leads to a lot of confusion, and it compounds that problem of how do you track down a Spring bean not found exception, which kills me. Anytime I encounter it or I see one of my coworkers encounter it, it's just a category of problem that you can only solve by learning Spring the framework. And a lot of people will give me a lot of shit for what I just said by saying, well, you should just learn the Spring framework. I'm just giving you an objective criticism of it as a framework, that this even is a category of problem. Someone should be able to pick up the framework and be very productive from day one without striking upon these really expensive type of runtime errors that are really hard to debug. So this is my third criticism, is lack of prescription around whether to use property injection, constructor injection, or setter injection. So all in all, I think this category of a dependency injection framework is really tough to come to from any other programming language to Java, which is what I did. I came from Python to Java. Python doesn't have dependency injection. JavaScript doesn't have dependency injection. Ruby doesn't have dependency injection. You could invent it, but you don't need it. And there aren't popular DI frameworks for those programming languages because it's just not needed. If you want to unit test something, and this is the common argument for dependency injection frameworks, is, well, how do you provide a mock to your unit tests so that you know that you can swap the type of mock you've got in your test with minimal code refactoring? And the reality is that's just not a problem in Python, Ruby, or JavaScript, is that it's just not a problem. I hadn't dealt with dependency injection frameworks before coming to Java, and I had no problem at all. In fact, one of the companies I worked for that was heavily built on Python IPO'd a few years after I left, and as far as I'm aware, we're entirely built on Ruby and Python. And I still don't grasp, many years on, why dependency injection frameworks are so critical to developing software with Java in 2022. So I would be remiss if I didn't actually provide some alternatives. I mentioned one of them earlier, which is Dagger, which is a dependency injection framework that Google's created that's used, from what I understand, for Android app development, but could be used for anything else. So Dagger is one DI framework alternative I'd recommend checking out instead of Spring. It's something that I'm doing, and I've done some tutorials, but haven't ventured to try and introduce it at my place of employment. Another alternative are web frameworks like DropWizard. I've worked through their tutorials, and that seems like a great app. I've made some tutorials on my YouTube channel about using Spark, the web app framework, not Spark, the data processing engine. But Quarkus is another, from what I've heard of. There's some great threads on Reddit about what are alternatives to Spring Boot. How do you develop Java code without Spring ecosystem? And yeah, I'll link some of those in the description of the video. Hope this video was helpful. I think it was. Let me know in the comments. Subscribe. I'll be making more videos. Curious to hear what kind of videos you want to hear about besides this one. So take care.